It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello there, David.
Hello, everybody. Another important show this morning.
Yes, indeed. And to help us through that is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello there, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. We're going to show what heroism is really about.
That's correct. Today, we continue our series on whistleblowing. On the show, we're going to feature a winner of the Joe A. Callaway Civic Courage Awards. Ralph, why don't you tell us what the Joe A. Callaway Awards are and how they came about?
That's quite a story. Joe A. Callaway was an impresario on Broadway, and he wanted to leave some of his estate to good works. And he figured out that one would be an annual award for people demonstrating civic courage. Not political, not business, not military, civic courage in our country, who are unsung, often shoved aside from their employment and mistreated. And so he contacted us by letter, and my sister Claire Nader has been administering these awards for the last 30 years. This is the 30th anniversary. And Joe Callaway stipulated that he wanted the award to go not only to people who demonstrated civic courage, but did so at some personal risk, like they risked their job, they risked their career, they risked their sustenance, whatever. And that stipulation has brought forth some of the finest people one could ever meet all over the country, taking their conscience to work, blowing the whistle, risking their careers, and trying to save lives, prevent injuries, prevent disease, save taxpayer money, and generally try to keep the country on a straight and narrow path of moral probity.
Our guest is George Luber, who is in charge of the climate change program at the Center for Disease Control. In other words, he was studying how a hotter planet will affect human health. But at the dawn of the Trump administration, not only was the term climate change removed from the CDC website, but Dr. Luber was directed to cancel a conference on climate change. He objected, and the CDC first attempted to fire him, then decided just to send him home on administrative leave and banned him from the building. Eventually, he went public with his story, and groups from across the world have begun campaigns to restore the climate change and health program. And as always, we will take a moment to find out what's happening in the dark recesses of the corporate underworld with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. And if we have time at the end, Ralph will answer some of your listener questions. But first, let's meet our Callaway Award winner. David?
Dr. George Luber is an epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. His research interests include the health impacts of environmental change and biodiversity loss, harmful algal blooms, and the health effects of climate change. Dr. Luber headed the CDC's climate health program until it was downgraded and diluted by the Trump White House in 2018. The nation's premier health protection agency continues to retaliate against him for speaking out on the climate crisis and its public health effects. He has since filed for whistleblower status with the Justice Department's Office of Special Counsel and has just received the Joe A. Callaway Award for Civic Courage. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. George Luber.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Welcome, yes, Dr. Luber, and congratulations on your Joe A. Callaway Award for Civic Courage, supremely deserved. I think before we get started, please explain, what does an epidemiologist do? I don't think there's enough of them in this country, and they're desperately needed. What does an epidemiologist do, and what different areas of health and safety have they been working on before we get into your situation?
Sure. Well, an epidemiologist is somebody that studies the patterns of diseases and the causes of diseases, covering almost an infinite amount of exposures and health outcomes. We look for a statistical association between a particular exposure, so bad air quality, and look for what that might do to certain parts of the population or as the population as a whole. We essentially, dives through data looking for causes of illness and death. And, my expertise covers a wide range of environmental exposures, which include bad water quality, air quality, extreme weather events, and the like, and try to build a case for why certain exposures are harmful to people's health.
Just to give a specific example from your own experience, epidemiologists such as yourself make connections. They make causal connections. They make all kinds of relationships that make us understand what's going on. And for example, if a new disease comes up and it's infectious, epidemiologists will try to find where it came from, the causes. He'll try to find who's most vulnerable, where the vulnerability is, and maybe find situations where people are not as vulnerable. It's so absolutely critical in a highly technological society. And there are just only a few thousand epidemiologists operating in the United States. So let's get to your area. The Centers for Disease Control arguably is the single most important agency in the federal government, because if you're dealing with global pandemics, viral pandemics, bacteria pandemics, and the such, you're dealing with potentially tens of millions of fatalities and hundreds of millions of sicknesses. And yet its budget is about $7.5 billion, which is half of what the Pentagon spends on the ballistic missile defense program that has never worked since Reagan opened it with great fanfare. They're now spending about $14 billion a year. That's the kind of priorities. Now, you had an 18-person staff inside the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. I believe the budget was about $10 million. Right. And you were supposed to be looking into the connection between global public health and climate disruptions, tornadoes, destruction of habitats, droughts, widespread fires, hurricanes. And for example, if you change the habitats, the malarial carrying mosquitoes will spread malaria beyond its present regions now. That's an example of how epidemiology works. You're working away at this, and then the Trump regime opens its doors in January 2017. So explain to our listeners what happened.
Well, I'd be happy to. Before I begin, though, it's important that I make it clear that, what I'm presenting to you today is my own statements. It doesn't represent the federal government or the agency in which I work. These are my own opinions and my own statements, and that I'm sitting here talking with you while I am on vacation leave. So I'm not using government time or resources to do so, just to make clear to everybody that this is on my own. So, yeah, the election happened in the fall of 2016. And a few weeks later, I got called into the director's office, the director for the National Center for Environmental Health that I work in. And he told me that, we've got a problem. I had been working on a large scientific meeting, a 3-day meeting that was going to be held at CDC headquarters in Atlanta, called the Climate and Health Summit. It was a science meeting for 3 days, and it was intended to raise awareness both within CDC and the broader public health community that, hey, there are folks working on climate change and health. We're actually kind of an obscure part of public health, but because of recent statements by the World Health Organization Director General Margaret Chan stating that climate change is the single greatest threat to public health in the 21st century, since the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 2014 report stating unequivocally that humans are changing the Earth climate system, and so on, that we wanted to get public health, who are, have their traditional bunkers that they work in, that there is groundbreaking work going on in climate change and health. So we had organized this meeting, again, with a blind eye to politics, which was rather naive considering what had been going on in the country. And in my infinite wisdom, I wanted to get high-level speakers for our meeting and called on Al Gore if he would like to be our keynote speaker. I thought he's a great advocate for climate change. And apparently that was a mistake because the director said, you have this meeting planned for February. This will be 3 weeks after the inauguration. And he said, you're going to have to cancel the meeting. And I was blown away. I said, we've spent this past 6-7 months working on this thing. We've got a full agenda. We've got invitees. It's all paid for. Money's out the door. Why are we canceling this meeting? He said, the optics aren't good. And I said, do you think the optics would be good if you canceled the meeting and the news press got a hold of this? This kind of sounds like scientific censorship, and we have a scientific integrity policy that prohibits us from doing this. And they said, the optics aren't good. I want you to send out a letter of cancellation. And I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not sending out a letter with my name on it, belying my scientific beliefs that this is an important topic. And they were surprised that I would be so obstinate, but I said, no, this is my professional credibility here. if you want to cancel the meeting, well, you're my boss, you can cancel the meeting, but I'm not doing it. And so they sent out a press release shortly after that the meeting was canceled. And I just steeled myself for some difficult times.
And this was very technical agenda here. It wasn't just a celebrity speaker who's written books on the subject. These were really people who've sunk their teeth into the nuances of this whole problem.
We had the best scientists. What we did was we solicited abstracts or short blurbs about what they'd like to, their research they'd like to speak on. We had a panel select the appropriate speakers. We had numerous sessions on very specific topics, changes in hydrogeology and waterborne diseases and very specific technical topics for public health that we had organized into sessions of several speakers. And we were aiming to have the biggest and best meeting of this type to date. And I think we had it. We had pulled together a fantastic meeting with all kinds of partners, professional organizations.
And it was open to the press, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I always thought the CDC was about as impervious to partisan political intrusion as a federal agency. I mean, in the past, Republican and Democrat administrations would not compete to manipulate politically what the CDC does. They didn't fund it adequately, but it was considered an agency of professional independence. And so I was pretty astonished, even with my minimal regard for the Trump people, that they began moving in. Now, how did they move in? Did they appoint a new director who was taking orders? Did they put people at secondary levels under the new director? I mean, it's astonishing that an agency that is full of PhDs and MDs, et cetera, suddenly became a political football for Donald Trump, who has called climate disruption, quote, a Chinese hoax, end quote. So how did this happen? And it came down on you like a hammer, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah, in my 17 years at the agency, I held the exact same view that this was a science-driven agency done so for the protection of people's health, and that politics had nothing to do with it. And I had operated my program and the strategies that we would employ, including, unfortunately, inviting Al Gore, in an apolitical environment. It's a wonderful organization with incredibly passionate and driven scientists that are so hungry for their mission that, we spend inordinate amount of hours working on work that we just have enormous pride in. And I have no direct knowledge of how this happened. The individual that Pat Bricey, the center director, that asked me to cancel the meeting was put in place during the Obama administration. I think at that time we had a director that was on his way out. We knew that. But I don't know who made this decision, or the most frightening thing, actually, is that somebody would make a decision like this in anticipating the potential blowback for the administration. And that, to me, is frightening because it's the most insidious form of power. And when you can get people to do things for you without even asking them, that, I think, is the most frightening thing, that people will act on your behalf in ways that they normally wouldn't, merely out of fear of what you might do. So, I suspect that's the case, and it frightens me that we would go down that path.
Well, one of the ways they kept you down was to reorganize, which is a typical bureaucratic technique. So what they took your 18-person climate and health program and subsumed it under a larger program dedicated to the problems of asthma.
Right.
And so it was fair to say that your program, while technically not abolished, it was degraded and diluted. And then they pushed you out, forbade you to even talk to your 18-member staff. And I understand that if you wanted to come back to where you worked for a visit, you had to get permission, and you were in a state of limbo, suspended but not fired. Could you describe that?
In addition, I was escorted by armed guards. When I needed to get some books out of my office and I had an armed escort, they asked me to come at 11 a.m., which is the height of the day when everybody's around, intending to humiliate me, and march me through our large 10-story office building with a large armed guard behind me that even followed me to the bathroom.
Everything but shackles and irons.
Correct. And Ralph, in my 17 years at the CDC, I have never been spoken to sideways. I've never been reprimanded in any way. I've received outstanding performance reviews and promotions that belie any attempt at making my character unsavory. So they did a number of things to the climate health program, which is appropriated in a discrete line item in the budget, which means Congress appropriates $10 million for climate and health program at CDC. Since it's a direct line, it cannot be, by law, used in any other way. And I, as a manager in charge of that appropriation, am responsible for making sure that the public's money is managed in an appropriate way, and that I'm a good steward of the public's money. And if Congress says work on climate and health, I cannot decide that this needs to be worked on for asthma prevention and management. So what they did was they took the climate health program that was standalone and the asthma program was standalone, along with a number of other programs, and they blended them together. And my program got merged with asthma. And I was made the acting branch chief of the program. And immediately my superiors had asked me to dismantle the team that I had built in climate change, which is a highly unique team with unique set of expertise, from climatology to geographic information systems, and a team that I had built that its sole purpose was to work on this unique set of challenges. And they wanted me to move those individuals into other teams in the asthma program. And I said, well, you can't do that because they're going to be supervising people that are working on different lines. And how are we going to get around that fact that you can't merge the personnel expenditure of their time between different programs? And there was one of my managers above me refused to answer that question, but her name is Lori Johnson, she had two contractors from PricewaterhouseCoopers, which I found highly unusual and odd, and I'd never seen this before, work with me on an organizational plan for this new branch and encourage me to accept this new organizational plan that would essentially blend the money. And I kept telling the contractors, you can't do this. They're like, well, Lori says you can. And I said, well, you can't. I've taken appropriations classes. I have to. And why isn't Lori in this meeting? Oh, well, she couldn't come. And this went on for several weeks, and I refused. I said, listen, unless we can address this topic of the appropriations, which I am responsible for, so I could get in trouble if I allowed this to happen because I know that it's illegal. And I said, Lori needs to tell me what the workaround is for this mixing of the money because I don't see how it could happen. And I'm not happy with this. And as we went back and forth, never with a response from Lori about the appropriateness of this, I was called into a meeting with the senior managers in the center. And it was quite odd because, got a call up to the director's office one day, and I sat down, and one of the deputy director for the center, Donna Knudsen, said, we have some troubling allegations against you. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And she said, did you author a book in 2015? And I said, well, yeah, I authored a textbook on climate change and health. And she says, well, we have no records in the ethics approval office because this was an activity I did on my own. And I got approval to do it. And since I had to let CDC ethics office know that I was working on it. She says, well, we have no evidence that you actually received ethics approval for it. I said, well, I did. I have the form in my office. Let me go get it. She's like, no, you need to hand me your phone, your badge, and your keys, and you need to leave campus now.
See, let me interrupt here. This is, listeners, the kind of top-down inquisition that they impose on people of conscience and competence in state bureaucracies, federal, state, local, and corporate bureaucracies. The larger point that Dr. Luber is making is that he refused to spend money contrary to what was authorized for his program by the U.S. Congress. He refused to spend money because if you spend money in an unauthorized way, that is a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, which prescribes a felony as a punishment. Now, to take an even bigger arc, what Donald Trump was doing this throughout federal regulatory agencies, moving money around for purposes it wasn't authorized, such as moving money from the Defense Department for schools and other social services for the children of military families to build his so-called wall on the Mexican border. That's a crime. That's not just an impeachable offense. It's a crime under the anti-deficiency law. And the other web you were caught up with, we were talking with Dr. George E. Luber, who was the head of the Climate and Health Program at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. The other aspect of this is that he is aiding and abetting a tremendous threat to our national security, which is climate disruption. It's already blowing apart communities, and you see it on TV news. And so it's not just that he's stopping you from trying to head it off in your particular way and stopping others from trying to minimize or mitigate these huge storms and tornadoes and droughts, etc. short term and long term. He's actually making it worse by unleashing coal burning pollution and scrapping control standards on greenhouse gases. Go oil, gas, go coal. He calls coal clean, beautiful coal. So he's aiding and abetting a massive assault from an abused nature against the health and safety and property values of our country, and actually making it worse. That should be an impeachable offense that Congress should pay attention to. Anyway, where are you now? I mean, you're sitting outside your workplace, outside the Centers for Disease Control. You've given the media interviews. You're very good about communicating with the media. Are they trying to stop you from doing that? Have they suspended your pay?
No, fortunately, they had served me charges in October of last year in 18. And with the help of lawyers from an organization called PEER, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, we were able to have those charges completely removed. They had accused me of all kinds of fabricated and just, I mean, so poorly done. I mean, I'm also a professor at Emory University, and I teach a class there regularly on climate and health. And they had accused me of having my subordinates teach classes for me, and which I didn't. And they said I was having them teach classes that I never even taught. They never bothered to check the class schedule to see if that course even existed. And they said, you had somebody teach this class. I'm like, I never taught that class. That's somebody else. And numbers of just anonymous accusations of something that I was able to, concretely show evidence that it wasn't even true. It was just remarkably poorly done, which I think I'm grateful for, the incompetence of the staff at the center. They were not able to put together a credible set of charges. Maybe it was done in order to help me. I'm hoping there's some folks on the inside that see some solidarity in this.
Talk about trumped up charges, eh?
Yeah. It was, and they removed all of them.
So they suspended you for 120 days to prevent you from speaking to the media?
They prevented me from speaking to the media going back before they removed me from my position. That goes back right after the Al Gore debacle. They cut off all my media access and travel access. And that drug on for about a year and plus. And then after my obstinance with not doing their dirty work with the appropriations money, that's when I was removed from campus. And since then, that was March of 18, I have been moved to different assignments around CDC, in assignments that are unrelated to, frankly, anything that I have expertise in. And I've been bounced around I'm on my fourth assignment, and I'm still working, and I'm prohibited from coming to the campus in which I'm assigned to. I work from home 100% of the time, isolated, and I review now scientific manuscripts on laboratory analysis of environmental exposure, something which I am profoundly unqualified to do. So I'm part of the clearance chain for laboratory manuscripts.
Listeners should know that one of the first things Donald Trump did was order the banning of the use of the term climate change, not only to Centers for Disease Control, but at the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies. I mean, this is like right out of the Kremlin in Stalinist Russia. And the second thing, they didn't like you appearing with Matt Damon in a show called Years of Living Dangerously.
Well, that was during the Obama years, and actually we got a good bit of support for that. I think they're perhaps, with the current crop of managers at the center, don't like the attention this topic is getting. And, it is, our little unit was one of the most productive in the center, and it was also the ones that they felt gave them the most vulnerability politically. And so anything they could do and they said to me, you need to lay low, take a low profile. And I saw this as a tremendous opportunity to raise our profile, and I refused to do so. We were in discussions with the National Geographic Channel Mars series, which is a very successful show there, for me to be a regular contributor to. And I received an email saying, George Luber will never be on that show, capitals, bolded, underlined. And they did not want me to seek media attention. And part of my job is to raise awareness on this issue. It is critically important that we take every opportunity we can to let the public know that this is a real and credible threat to you now in your communities, and you should be worried.
Well, fortunately, you're being represented pro bono by this wonderful nonprofit group in Washington and Eugene, Oregon called PEER, which started out to protect the scientific integrity of foresters in the U.S. Forest Service who opposed clear cutting on behalf of companies like Weyerhaeuser and were retaliated against. So you're in good hands. You have filed through them, a whistleblower retaliation complaint with the Office of Special Counsel, which is in the Justice Department, seeking an investigation and a defense of your rights. What are you seeing in terms of your 18 colleagues? Are they distancing themselves? Are they silently supporting you? How's the personal impact on you?
Well, the personal impact is tremendous, but it'd be much worse without the folks at Peer, especially Kevin Bell, one of the most competent and dedicated lawyers that I've ever encountered. And they work tirelessly on this issue. And they remind me of my staff who took this issue of climate change to heart and made it their life's mission, their life's work. These people are driven to work on this topic because they want to contribute. And of the 18 staff, several have left. You know, we're a group that has different skill sets, project managers, et cetera, communicators, and so on and so forth. But the heart of the scientific knowledge base at that group is all gone. Myself, you know, I've been a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I've written the textbook on this issue. I've been convening lead author for the 3rd and 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment, on and on. And what's left in the program, unfortunately, is not much expertise. And that is really what's lost, is the core knowledge base that we need in order to move this forward. We're left with individuals with not much experience or credentials on this. And yes, I do keep in contact with some of them, but frankly, it is a culture of fear right now. And many have told me, George, I support you. I can provide evidence that would exonerate you on this charge undoubtedly, but I cannot do so because I fear that I will be retaliated against. They have been told directly by the new person who took over from me, Josephine Malile, that if they speak to the press, and we have a First Amendment right to be able to do so on our own time, and I've been advised of that by CDC General Counsel on numerous occasions, that you will get in trouble if you speak to the press. And if you do get contacted by the press, you need to report it to me immediately. That's the typical type of intimidation factors that go along with this. And so we have a group of young, smart, and scared individuals.
Well, George, you know, some listeners may be wondering, how can these federal employees over you do such things to you? What recourse do you have against them personally? What lawsuits can be filed against them personally, all the way up to the White House level? Are they all immune?
I wish I had Kevin here to help me with that question, because I really don't know the answer to that. You know, we're focused on CDC restoring the program as it was intended by Congress to do, having it in hands of managers that are good stewards of the public's money in order to run this program, who care about this topic. There are parts of CDC that would love to have this program and see it flourish.
Well, do you have a patron or two in Congress? When there was a whistleblower, Ernie Fitzgerald, in the Pentagon on the C-5A air cargo plane, and he showed that the plane had a tendency to lose a wing now and then, he was really pounced on in the Pentagon, and he went to Senator Proxmire, William Proxmire from Wisconsin, who became one of his defenders and had hearings on the subject. Do you have any backers by name in the House and Senate? And if not, why not?
Well, we do. I actually just about a half an hour ago recorded a video for social media for Senator Bernie Sanders. And you, of course, know that his stance on this topic is very strong, and they've been supportive. On the House side, there have been a number of efforts to support this. Congresswoman Lauren Underwood from Michigan has proposed legislation to have the climate program restored as an individual unit. And Congresswoman Shalala, as well, has expressed tremendous support for this issue and is working, I believe, with appropriations on what can be done about this.
I might add, Congresswoman Shalala was a former Secretary of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration. And
That's
she
right.
ran for Congress after being president of a major university in Florida. Why don't you try Senator Edward Markey to back you too?
Again, yes, I believe the legislative affairs folks at Peer and another whistleblower group called the Government Accountability Project are working with Markey, as well as a few others. Senator Whitehouse, I believe.
Well, listen, listeners, this is not just about Dr. George Luber. Let me read you a passage in the Joe A. Callaway Award for Civic Courage about Dr. Luber. Quote, "His unremitting position on behalf of scientific method, integrity, and expertise, presently under attack as never before in history, is an unwavering beacon for other federal government climate scientists suffering similar retaliation. Using his many splendored approach and communication skills, through academic publications and in popular media. Dr. Luber pledged he will, quote, not go away, end quote, tenaciously responding to intensifying climate chaos, end quote. I have a little point to make to any Trump voters who are listening to this program. I know that you love Donald Trump. In fact, you may be part of many Trump voters who say, when they're asked, the following. People say Trump is crazy, but what he's saying is what I'm thinking. Does that mean I'm crazy? Well, let me tell you, we'll leave that judgment to yourself, Trump voters. But what Dr. Luber wants to make sure is that you don't get an infectious disease and infect others because you're under health and safety protection. That's what he's looking for. It doesn't matter whether you're Republican, Democrat, conservative, or liberal. You better pay attention to the smasheroos who are breaking up the Centers for Disease Control, politicizing them, favoring the big corporations who don't want certain things done, and stifling people like George Luber, who relentlessly were determined to take their conscience to work so they can help save your lives or anticipate and prevent global pandemics and epidemics. David and Steve, jump in here.
I'm confused about the hierarchy over at the CDC. Who are you taking orders from in terms of their education? What kind of degrees do these people have who are giving you these orders? Are these doctors? Are these PhDs?
Yeah, well, the center directors of PhDs and industrial hygienists, but I believe the real direction of whether, the meeting should be canceled was not. This is a director that is frequently on travel. Unlike, I think this is my fifth center director. This center director spends a tremendous amount of time out of town and is remarkably absent for much of his tenure here. And therefore, the shop is run by folks without PhDs. These are policy people. And that's a trend that I've noticed at CDC over my 17 years. And we've always, impressed on the fact that science directs policy, right, at this agency. However, that's changed. Now policy directs science in very prescriptive ways. And so the policy people stepped in and had their wisdom about how to manage the Trump administration, and this is where we're at. I think that a lot of these efforts are just done without care, managing the public's money or being good stewards or being conscious as to our scientific integrity policy, which should drive all of our efforts. The folks that were trying to directly get me to move the money around don't have advanced degrees that I'm aware of. They're budget people and managers of non-science. We have two tracks, a science management and a management side. Regardless, I always maintain that we should, play by the rules and do it the way it was intended and let the science lead the way.
Yeah, I don't understand why doctors allow themselves to be ordered around by their inferiors. And it seems to happen in the healthcare debate.
It's just abdicating the responsibility for that, frankly.
So just to be clear, you said the person who told you the optics would be bad was not a Trump political appointee, just someone feeling the pressure either directly or indirectly that this would be a bad idea to do with the new regime. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. So he had started during the Obama years, and I don't have any knowledge. This could have been right around the time that the transition teams, beachhead crew or something they call it, where the people come to the agency immediately. And I had heard from another source through a Union of Concerned Scientists anonymous survey that a senior manager at CDC had said, there were 5 key areas that the Trump administration wanted to be targeted during this administration. It would be anything under the Affordable Care Act, birth control, gun violence, abortion rights, and climate change. And these are the topics that they're interested in. Now, I don't know if this advanced team had already made these wishes known to my leadership, but it was odd for me to get called in and say, you're going to have to cancel this meeting that we spent a good bit of time. We'd already spent the money and a good bit of personnel time to get this going, and it was a solid conference. And plus, I said the optics are terrible on canceling the meeting. And certainly, of course, the Washington Post ran a story critical of CDC on canceling the meeting. Is this censorship? And it was very odd that they would make that, because their argument for laying low certainly didn't work. Because who would really honestly write a story about a science meeting at CDC about climate change? No one would write a national level media story about a climate meeting at CDC. But now they did write about it because it was canceled.
Let me ask you this. Would you return to your position with a change of administrations that wanted to reinstate your program?
Absolutely. I decided, I got my PhD right as 9/11 happened. And sitting there watching those images, I actually turned down an offer at Stanford and decided to pursue a life of public service. I made it my goal to provide a service to this country. And I felt obliged to do it at that. Sitting there watching, those towers come down. And 2 weeks later, I applied to CDC and got a postdoc and have dedicated my life to doing that. And I'm not giving up now. And these people come and go. I mean, I've watched, center directors come and go and CDC directors and my managers come and go. But the people who do the science, who do the work on the ground, they stay and they're dedicated. And we've gotten used to seeing these people come and go. And, I've maintained I also teach at Emory, I mentioned, and they have been wanting me to come over there. And I said, I'm in this fight and I'm going to make sure that this comes out well, because if people like me walk away, and who's left to care?
How has the pressure been on you professionally and personally?
Incredible sense of isolation. Many of my colleagues throughout the government have essentially ghosted me. Now, that's counterbalanced by a tremendous amount of support from the folks of the Callaway Award, Hugh Hefner Foundation, from news reporting and, colleagues around the world. I received a stack the other day of around 20 postcards that was part of a letter writing campaign encouraging me to keep up my fight. And that really helps keep me going. But my colleagues at CDC are afraid, and many of them have disappeared. And I think, I tell myself that it's a measure of somebody's character and how they respond in moments like this. And that folks would slink away and ignore it. Well, that's a measure of their character. And for those who stand up and fight and support me, well, then, I know a little bit more about them.
We're talking with Dr. George E. Luber, who was formerly the head of the critically important climate and health program as an epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, and a professor adjunct at Emory University. If you were in charge of climate disruption policy, what would you do in terms of the federal government? What kind of resources, what priorities beyond your own program at the CDC?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because that was a question the Hillary campaign asked me 4 months before the election. And they reached out to me, again, my personal email and all that. And we spent some time coming up with because we've got $10 million might sound like a lot of money, but in a federal program, it's really kind of a pilot type program. You mentioned, the difference between the DOD budget and CDC, but this too, even for a CDC program, is quite small. But what we had developed was a program that was directed right at on the ground public health. This is local, city, and state public health, and to deliver to them all the tools and intelligence that they needed in order to identify which threats would be relevant in their area, because frankly, the threats from climate change in Florida are going to be dramatically different from those in Maine or Oregon, and a whole different set of issues, wildfires versus mosquitoes, et cetera. So we had a tailor-made program called the BRACE program, Building Resilience Against Climate Effects, that would work with, these high-resolution type efforts at getting help to the most vulnerable in our state, in our community, and in our country. And our plan with what I described to the Hillary campaign was that we would scale up this program and bring it to we currently worked with 16 states and 2 cities, and we bring it to all 50 states, to territories, to tribal governments, and to large cities around the country. And that we would also, along with CDC, that we would need to bring money to NIH to fund regional centers of excellence. The EPA would need some funding to help support the environmental monitoring aspect of our program that was so critical, that NOAA would be required to dedicate some resources to giving us the high-resolution climate models that we would need to project what these risks are. So we detailed an intergovernmental program that had been in the works because I had spent time working with my colleagues around the government in order to kind of make those connections. Where is this information? How can we get the resources that we'd need to attack this on a grand scale? But we had done it in a way that would be scalable. And so for the last 7 years had been, testing the proof of concept, and we're confident that we could scale it up. The first thing in the world, actually, national level adaptation program for climate and health. So successful that the governments of England, Public Health England, the government of Austria, Peru, and Chile, and Canada as well, had adopted our framework as the gold standard for preparing public health for climate change.
And what would you have Congress do in terms of informing the public? What kind of hearings you think they're not having, they should have? And in that context, how do you expand the number of epidemiologists?
Well, you have to train the epidemiologists, and that was what the shame was that, I had trained a cadre of young professionals that were highly skilled in order to have the skill set, and very, very unique. It's not like you just hire somebody, you go to a job site and you find somebody with these skills. You have to train them. You have to, nurture them. They've all disappeared. So we have to start it all over again, the momentum that we've lost. I'm a bit naive as to the workings of Congress, but the fact that our nation's, the world's leading public health agency is stepping away from its principle of scientific integrity is not just troubling for climate change, but if you think about it, the integrity, the respect or the honesty of an agency like CDC is all that it has. If the public can't trust that this is the best science of an agency like that, and we always learn this at CDC, that what you do reflects upon the integrity of this agency, and that's essentially all we have. So protect it with your life.
And listeners should realize that with climatologists and epidemiologists making the connection between the burning of oil, gas, and coal and all kinds of diseases and property damage and affecting flora and fauna points the way to shifting our economy toward renewable energy like solar energy, wind energy, passive solar, solar voltaic, maybe even geothermal. And in that sense, reducing the greenhouse gases and reducing the causal effects of increasing climate disruption. So you see, that's the importance of the kind of work that Dr. Luber and his colleagues are doing. And to literally try to destroy it is a crime against humanity. When you try to destroy someone, let's say, who's trying to find a cure for malaria, that would be considered a crime against humanity. So whenever you evaluate what we should expect of presidents of the United States, it's important to crank in these kinds of functions that are not going to be advanced by ExxonMobil or Peabody Coal. They're going to be advanced by public servants, such as Dr. George Luber. Before we end, any more comments or questions from Steve and David?
Dr. Luber, this is a scientific question. What do you think the biggest threat is as a result of this climate crisis?
Well, we've always said at the Climate Health Program that the effects of climate change are place-specific and path-dependent. And that's kind of a scientific way of saying, gosh, it all depends. The biggest threat, in my opinion, ironically, this is the biggest threat overall long-term, is the threat that increased carbon dioxide has on the acidity of the oceans and the impact that CO2 has on plants. What we are learning is that CO2 in elevated levels, 6, 7, we're at 415, 418 parts per million right now. But if we have an atmospheric concentration of around 600 parts per million, which we expect by the latter part of this century, what we're realizing is that plants are negatively affected by this elevated CO2, especially C3, C4 photosynthetic plants, which form the kind of core of our food crops: rice, wheat, barley, sorghum, millet. All of the starches that we feed the planet on show that under elevated CO2 levels that we would expect by the end of this later part of this century, that the protein levels are reduced by 15 to 20%, the crude protein. The plants are actually stressed under these elevated CO2 levels. And they're rising so fast that plants cannot adapt. It's the rate of change is so fast that the plants cannot adapt to this elevated CO2, and they are stressed. And as a result, not only the crude protein reduces by 15 to 20%, the micronutrients, vitamins are also reduced as well. So we have a nutritional crisis. Imagine a planet of 7 billion people now, and crop production stays the same, but we're at 9 billion people, and we have crops that are 15 to 20% less nutritious. That is an impending nutritional crisis, and everybody in public health knows that at the cornerstone of any healthy population is a healthy immune system, and undernourished people don't have healthy immune systems.
Doctor, expand that to the impact on the ocean and how the boomerang comes back on land.
So the ocean also experiences stress at high CO2 levels. It actually absorbs CO2 and becomes more acidic. What we learn is that under high acidity conditions, which are already occurring now, that the organisms that form the basis of the food web of the oceans, the calcareous organisms, these are the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, that form hard exoskeleton shells, under those elevated acidity levels, cannot form their shells, that their shells are weak and dissolved. And under higher CO2 levels, the potential for the collapse of the food base of the oceans is apparent, and that we lose the food base, those small organisms that, again, feed the rest of the food web up, we could have a crash in marine ecosystems, which are tremendously important for human nutrition.
And then much more intense hurricanes coming out of warming patterns that are changing in the oceans. Can you say a few words about that?
Well, we do know that most weather events, extreme weather events, are intensifying under climate change. Heat waves are of longer duration and more intense, hotter. Hurricanes appear to show a signal of getting more intense. We're not sure if they're getting more frequent. Precipitation is increasingly coming down in heavy short bursts rather than gentle rains. All of those things affect public health. Now, those things are things that we, given the appropriate attention, we can adapt to. What I was describing earlier with the CO2 problem is intractable. This is a problem that we don't have solutions for. And what's ironic about it is that they are major problems that have nothing to do with weather or climate. They have to do with a carbon pollution problem. It's related to climate change is that the excess carbon changes weather, but it also changes fundamental parts of our ecosystem that we rely on.
But one of the more fearful results are the melting of the glaciers and the building up of sea levels, inundating cities with hundreds of millions of people around the globe, from India to the United States. Explain that a bit.
Well, 80% of the world's population lives near oceans, so there's going to be after major retreat from the coastlines with sea levels, depending on the climate model or what we're learning, how quickly that might happen. But it's certainly happening and will happen. Those are problems that, again, given the amount of resources and effort, we can retreat from the oceans, or we're going to have to. But there will be a tremendous amount of suffering associated with that. And while we're waiting to retreat or waiting to come to terms with this problem, we will certainly have, coastal inundation events that will kill many thousands of people. And the time to act on that is now.
We learned from an earlier program, Dr. Luber, that Miami Beach in Florida has a plan to evacuate not just people close to the ocean, but to evacuate Miami Beach.
Yes. They are already experiencing regular inundation events with high tides. I mean, this is a regular occurrence right now. And places that experience these types of events, they get it. They understand the threat and the disruption to life and economy and community that this happens. When people get displaced, they don't just lose their home, they lose their community, they lose their livelihoods. And those have consequences as well.
Well, I'm sitting in Southern California right now in Los Angeles area where wildfires are raging. And at any moment, they're telling me I'm getting notices from Southern California Edison that they're going to turn off the power. Fortunately, they didn't do it during the show because their fear of the high winds will knock down power lines and start another wildfire. So I can personally attest to the effects of what you're talking about. And exactly what you're talking about is exactly what the Trump administration and his backers don't want anybody to hear, and why you were in this situation.
One of my colleagues and one of the top people on climate and health, Kirk R. Smith out of UC Berkeley, had once said, and this is a very important quote, I guess, that in a world of climate change, the rich will find their world to be more polluted, more uncomfortable, colorless, and a bleaker world. The poor will die.
As the poor pay more in our economy as well. You're quite right there. The most vulnerable areas are populated by low-income people. Well, one last thing. I hope we don't hear the word climate change anymore, not because of Trump's censorship, but because it's too benign a phrase created by Frank Lutz, the right-wing Republican wordsmith in 2002, to replace the more alarming global warming phrase. So I hope we all use words like climate crisis, climate disruption, climate catastrophe, global warming, and deprive Frank Lutz of his semantic colonialism. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. George Luber. Congratulations on your Joe A. Callaway Award for Civic Courage. Congratulations to PEER for holding up its defense of your rights as a civil servant. And congratulations to all of you listening who are alert and come to the rescue of courageous people like Dr. George Luber.
Thank you so much.
We've been speaking with Dr. George Luber. We will link to more of his story and the Callaway Awards at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Right now, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, Ralph is going to answer some of your questions. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, November 8, 2019. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Oregon worker safety inspectors found serious workplace safety violations at a Dollar Tree in Portland, Oregon, after a rodent infestation. That's according to a report from television station KGW in Portland. Oregon OSHA fined the company $1,900. In August, the Dollar Tree store in Portland's Lloyd district temporarily shut down after a KGW investigation found ripped food packaging, chewed food labels, rodent feces on shelves, and a dead mouse in an air vent. The store has since reopened. Employees complained of nausea, lightheadedness, and headaches after being exposed to dead mice, rodent urine, and droppings. Oregon OSHA records indicate Dollar Tree didn't do enough to keep rodents out of the store and failed to provide proper safety equipment for employees who were asked to clean up. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Now, before we do listener questions, Ralph, John Conyers died recently, and I know you'd worked closely with him over the years. He was in Congress for almost 60 years, I believe, or more than 60 years. Tell us a little about your relationship, about John Conyers and your relationship with him.
Well, Congressman Conyers was the dean of the African-American delegation in the House, as they called it, and he helped start the Black Caucus. He was extremely responsive. You could get him on the phone. He would return calls. That's a very rare trait today for members of Congress, because if you can't get through to people, you can't get anything underway to begin with. That's how critical it is. And he'd invite you down to his office, a group of civic advocates and leaders, and obviously he was great on civil rights, but he also tried to jumpstart a federal intense program on cracking down on corporate crime. It never got anywhere, but at least he introduced the legislation and he proposed it when he was a senior figure on the House Judiciary. He was also a champion of ballot access for third parties, even though he was a longstanding member of the Democratic Party, and he introduced legislation to that effect. He's clearly one of the most progressive members of the House of Representatives on numerous fronts, including being anti-war in our modern times. He left Congress a couple years ago under a cloud of personal matters, but that doesn't really take away from what he did over about a half a century of representing portions of Detroit, Michigan in the House of Representatives, and taking seriously his title of U.S. representative, not just representative from Detroit.
Well, thank you for that, Ralph. Let's do some listener questions now. This next one comes from Jay Goldberg, who is a regular listener. I think we did one of his questions a couple weeks ago. And he said, in the wrap-up to this week's show, Ralph offered a couple of reasons why Medicare for some is a bad idea. But I think he overlooked the most obvious one. People would have to buy into it, so instead of being funded through progressive taxation, it would be an option only for those who could afford it or whose employers provide it, as private insurance is now. I suppose there could be a government subsidy for low-income groups similar to what Obamacare provides, but they would never be as progressive as the taxes Bernie and Liz are proposing and would never be provided to the majority of working people. Also, Medicare for some would have to call for deductibles and copays, or no one would opt for private insurance. Is Jay correct there, Ralph?
Yeah, he makes a good point, and he provokes even further good points. Number one, it's a setup to be taken over the way Medicare Advantage, corporate run, has now taken over 1 out of every 3 elderly people's Medicare insurance. People don't realize that all these ads they hear about Medicare Advantage is just a euphemism for takeover by companies like United Healthcare and Aetna of Medicare under contract. And as Dr. Fred Hyde said, it's not what you pay, it's what you get. And there are a lot of trapdoors in Medicare Advantage, and elderly people should be aware of it. And so should people be if there was a Medicare for some or public option. The other thing is Medicare for some does not control costs. When you have full Medicare for all, the corollary is restraint on skyrocketing drug prices, restraint on skyrocketing hospital prices, minimizing fraud in the healthcare area. That's the experience in Canada.
It's funny, Ralph. I had this discussion after we did that show with a college classmate of mine who I happen to run into. And one of my college classmates is Tom Steyer, who's running for president. And this woman who I also know said, "Hey, you're supporting Tom." And I said, "Well, I like a lot of what Tom says about corporate power. And obviously he's been a leader on the climate crisis, but I'm not sure about his healthcare policy." And she says, "But he's talking about choice." And so I ran down basically what we talked about last week.
Mm-hmm.
And she kept the smile on her face, but her eyes just went completely dead.
It's amazing. People make up their minds permanently. They close off the kind of information that I think otherwise they would be more receptive of.
Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. I want to thank our guest again, George Luber from the CDC. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And Ralph has got 2 new books out, The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And To the Ramparts, How Bush and Obama Paved the Way for the Trump presidency and Why It Isn't Too Late to Reverse Course. We will link to that also.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Calcareous. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak to another whistleblower who won his Callaway Prize by taking on Boeing, John Barnett. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. More stations, more podcast listeners. Spread the word, listeners.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where Ralph answers more of your questions and one of David's.
Can I ask you a question, Ralph, about the fires in Los Angeles? The very rich people are using private firefighters. Shouldn't we have a choice in America when there's a fire where you can opt in for... I'm being serious. Why are you laughing? Because
I don't think people would like it. Imagine you're living on the street. Some houses are serviced by the local municipal fire department, and other houses are serviced by private contractors. Do I need to provoke your imaginative mind, David, for you to explain what ridiculous scenarios can proceed from that?
But Mayor Pete says it's all about choice. America's all about choice. Well, I don't understand. And he went to Harvard just like you, Ralph.
So, Mayor Pete, I think, is striving ahead of his experience.
Yeah.
He's a very, very fluent candidate, but he tries to have it both ways, the way some Democrats do.
Do they know they're lying? Does somebody like Mayor Pete, when he talks about opting in for Medicare for some, does he know that's a lie, that it would never work?
He thinks it's better incrementally than the present system, and that satisfies him, and that doesn't qualify as a lie. He's a gradualist. You can't call gradualists liars.
Yes. They never taught you about the incrementi at Harvard, ancient Greek, the incrementalists.
Incrementi.
The incrementi. It's a Greek word.
It's a secret society.
No, they were philosophers. They believed in focusing on all our differences, our identity, so we could keep our money. That was the incrementi from ancient Greece.
All right. So, David, I want you to read this next question, and I only included it because it kind of made me laugh.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that I would have.
It is the kind of thing you would have. So do the next question.
Did I write this?
Yeah. Go ahead.
This comes to us from Joe Prete, or Preet, I'm sorry. He says, Ralph, I've been searching for a Corvair Corsa coupe in restorable condition. And a friend said that I should contact you if you have one. I think he does. I think Ralph does have one up in Winstead. If you have one available for sale or know of one, please contact me via email ASAP. Thank you kindly, Joe Prete or Preet. Don't you have one at the Tort Museum?
Joe, there's one at the Tort Museum, but obviously it's not going to be dismantled and sold on the market. Joe, I have the answer to your question. I don't sell Corvairs, by the way. There's a group called Corvair Club of America. Look it up. Last I heard, it had 6,000 Corvair owners as dues-paying members. And I'm sure they will lead you to the vibrant market of exchanging Corvairs, buying and selling old Corvairs and their parts. There's also a parts business operation up in northern Massachusetts, and they might help you as well. I can't give you the email, but the Corvair Club of America knows the whole network.
See, Joe, you even got an answer.
Are they doing that ironically? I mean, I know they have their Corvairs, but are they doing it to defy Ralph Nader?
No, it's just they think it's a beautiful car. It's a classic car. It's appreciating in value. And they created an affinity group. It's like the affinity you have with Triumph, the insult dog. I once was invited to speak to their annual convention.
That's right. You were a guest of honor.
Yes. I walked in and I saw icicles forming in the air. So I got up on the stage and I said to myself, I got to open a dialogue with these good people. And so I said, there's one thing we're all going to agree on in this room, is that in this room, there are some of the best drivers in the world. They got the point.
Yeah. Were they able to repair? Does it still turn over?
Well, first of all, Corvairs from 1965 on were stabilized. They still had the carbon monoxide leakage problem, by the way. But they have ways of putting in stabilizers, and that's a lot of what they discuss. They have different parts, and some of them are manufactured, some of them are remanufactured. But they do believe that if you're a really good driver, you won't go out of control in a Corvair. That's why my comment resonated with them.
All right, very good. Our next question comes from Stephen Katz. The subject is Ditch Mitch. And Stephen says, I have rarely disagreed with Ralph in my lifetime, but was very disappointed to hear him voice support of Amy McGrath to run against Mitch McConnell in next year's Kentucky senatorial election. As a Kentuckian, I know that she is a proven loser that couldn't even win in the much more liberal than most of the state's 6th congressional district last year and would have no chance in a statewide race. McConnell is unpopular and very vulnerable. There are potential Democratic candidates that can beat him, but not McGrath. She recently opined that one of McConnell's failings is inadequate support of Donald Trump. I find it infuriating to receive a stream of solicitations from groups like the DSCC, which is the, David, you know this, the Democratic Senatorial Congressional Committee, something?
Yes. Yeah.
Campaign Committee.
Who aren't disclosing that they are funneling cash to McGrath in order to ditch Mitch. A2, Ralph?
Well, I'm sorry I misled you. My opposition is to retire McConnell. And I was told by politicians who seem to be trustworthy that McGrath has a lock on the nomination. If she doesn't, that's good news, because she is a sort of corporate Democrat. And she may well lose to Mitch McConnell, who's one of the worst campaigners in the country, by the way. And the reason why he wins again and again is the train wreck that is the Kentucky Democratic Party. I mean, they've been in a rut for years, and they've allowed this terrible senator to do such horrible things, including putting corporate judges in courts all over the country, right up to the Supreme Court. So if there are people who can challenge her, send me their names. There is a parallel nonprofit group called Ditch Mitch that has staff growing in Kentucky just to get out the vote against McConnell. I don't know whether they have endorsed McGrath. I doubt it, because they're a nonprofit group. Contact them, Steve, and enlighten them, since you're in Kentucky and know the scene much better than outsiders do. The other thing is, This often happens. If I oppose somebody, they think I automatically endorse his or her opponent. That's not the case. I'm opposing McConnell, but that doesn't mean I'm endorsing one of the potential nominees, even though she's reputed to be the leading contender. She is campaigning on her career as a fighter pilot, and I don't think that's enough. She's got to receive the advice of people like Congressman Yarmouth, who doesn't seem to have her ear.
Right, and I think her strength, she can match her military record against Mitch McConnell's military record. He was apparently discharged under a cloud that he hasn't
Well, you know,
fully
David, that doesn't get you votes anymore. Look at draft dodger George W. Bush, draft dodger Bill Clinton, draft dodger Donald Trump. Of course, you know where they ended up.
Yeah, I heard news about that. Yeah, I think I've heard that.
No, but they love our military.
I mean, it used to be political suicide 40, 50 years ago. Now it's just like water off a duck's back. Doesn't seem to affect the voters, especially when you're a draft dodging George W. Bush. I know he was in the Air National Guard, but that was a way to avoid the draft. He supported the Vietnam War. He supported the Vietnam War and wanted his colleagues from the universities to go to Vietnam and fight and kill and let him stay at home. That didn't cost him the elections. Well, of course, he never was elected in 2000. He was selected by the Electoral College, and Gore won the popular vote nationally by 500,000 votes. In most countries, that would be enough to win. But in the U.S., you have 535 people whose names you never heard of, who weren't elected to anything popularly, deciding who the next president is. We got to get rid of this Electoral College. It's already selected George W. Bush, who lost the popular vote in 2000, and he selected Donald Trump, who lost the popular vote in 2016 by almost 3 million. Enough already.
You forgot Pierre Delecto, the 2012 Republican nominee who spent his time in Paris instead of Vietnam. That would be Romney. This is from Aaron Omley. Hi, Ralph, longtime listener, and I voted for you every chance I've had. Why hasn't the Green Party and Dr. Jill Stein received any credit for the Democrats' Green New Deal? I know from your podcast that progress always starts from smaller parties until the larger ones catch up to public opinion, but some credit would be nice.
First, the Republican Party has no interest in giving any credit to the Green Party because of its challenge to corporate power. And the Democratic Party only uses small progressive parties as scapegoats, blaming them for any defeat that the Democrats at the congressional or presidential level suffer. It's scapegoating that has obscured the vision of the Democratic Party and allowed its continued subservience to corporate lobbies and corporate campaign cash. That's why they don't want to give the Green Party, which had in effect the Green New Deal over 25 years ago in the United States.
Hillary says Dr. Jill Stein is a Russian asset. So
Hillary's performing in a Trumpian fashion.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.